I knew I was screwed the moment I saw the Team Unity Buffett nobody orders fruit platters at 3 p.m. unless there's a backstabbing in progress. The HR department had arranged the conference room with uncomfortable precision strawberries and pineapple chunks positioned in corporate-approved concentric circles, bottled water with motivational quotes, and 3 people with clipboards wearing expressions of rehearsed empathy. Classic termination setup. My replacement stood in the corner, smiling like a first-time startup failure. He couldn't have been older than 24, wearing what appeared to be a silk shirt under a blazer that still had the price tag shadow on the sleeve. His Apple Watch kept lighting up, probably displaying notifications from whichever mindfulness app was trending that week. I'm Juliet Cross, 35 Senior DevOps Infrastructure Engineer at Vexlin Systems, or at least I was until Fruit played o'clock. 12 years of building their backend from scratch. Nights spent nursing servers through updates and creating deployment systems that actually worked rather than just looked good in PowerPoint presentations. My crime being too expensive and not fitting the refreshed vision of our new management consultant. Juliet, began Diane from HR, her voice hitting that particular pitch reserved for corporate execution squads. As you know, Vexlin is undergoing strategic realignment to position ourselves for future growth opportunities. I nodded, resisting the urge to complete her sentence with, by firing anyone who remembers when the company actually had working products. Instead, I maintained eye contact and took a deliberately large strawberry from the plate. We're implementing a transition plan that unfortunately impacts your role, she continued, sliding a folder across the table with the efficiency of someone who had practiced this move in front of a mirror. The folder contained what I expected: severance package mediocre, non-disclosure agreement extensive, and return of company property form hilarious, considering I'd built most of their systems on my personal laptop before transferring ownership. This is Trevor. Diane motioned to my replacement, who stepped forward with the confidence of someone who believed TED Talks constituted actual experience. He'll be taking over your infrastructure responsibilities. We'd like you to onboard him this afternoon. This afternoon, I repeated, letting the absurdity hang in the air. Yes, we've allocated 4 hours for knowledge transfer, said Malcolm, our CTO, who had mysteriously appeared at these meetings only after decisions had been made. Trevor comes highly recommended with a degree in cyber literary systems from Cyber Literary Systems. I interrupted, unable to contain myself. It's an interdisciplinary approach to digital infrastructure through narrative frameworks. Trevor explained, his voice carrying the earnest tone of someone who had never been woken at 3 a.m. because production was down. I glanced at my watch. 4 hours to transfer 12 years of institutional knowledge to someone who thought systems engineering was a literary genre. The absurdity of it all crystallized into a perfect moment of clarity. I wasn't going to sabotage their system. I was simply going to leave it as a poem which this bright young thing would mistake for documentation. I'd be happy to onboard Trevor, I said, with a smile that made Malcolm shift uncomfortably in his seat. And that's how it began, my masterpiece of malicious compliance that would eventually cost Vexlin Systems $15,000 to undo. The onboarding room was small and windowless, chosen specifically, I imagined, to prevent me from throwing either myself or Trevor through glass in a moment of desperation. The walls were that particular shade of off-white that corporate America had decided represented both neutrality and soul-crushing conformity. So, I'm really excited to learn from you. Trevor started, pulling out a moleskin notebook that looked too pristine to have ever captured an actual thought. I've been studying your deployment architecture from afar, and I'm fascinated by the non-linear approach. I blinked. Non-linear approach. The way you've structured the dependencies, they don't follow conventional hierarchy. It's almost poetic. I hadn't intended our systems to be poetic. They'd evolved organically over years of putting out fires and implementing solutions that worked rather than adhered to whatever framework was being championed at the latest tech conference. But Trevor's comment sparked something in me, a flicker of mischievous inspiration. You know what, Trevor? You're absolutely right, I said, pulling my chair closer to his. What you're sensing isn't accidental. Our entire infrastructure is built on the structural principles of James Joyce's Finnegans Wake. His eyes widened. Really, that's brilliant. It wasn't brilliant. It was complete nonsense. But the look of reverence on Trevor's face told me everything I needed to know about how the next 4 hours would unfold. Few people understand this, I said, lowering my voice conspiratorially. Malcolm certainly doesn't. That's why our system works when others fail. It's built on literary recursion rather than technological repetition. I opened my laptop and pulled up our system architecture diagram, a fairly standard representation of our AWS infrastructure with various microservices and databases. You see this main production cluster here? I pointed to the central node. We call it Annalivia. After Annalivia Plurabelle from the novel, Trevor whispered, scribbling furiously in his notebook. Exactly. And our staging environment is Humpchip representing Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker, while our backup system is naturally called the Wound. Because a wound with a wonder and a wild desire from page 340, Trevor completed, his eyes shining with what I can only describe as religious fervor. I hadn't actually read Finnegans Wake. Few humans have made it through that impenetrable text. I'd once attempted the first 20 pages before deciding life was too short, but Trevor's eager nodding suggested he was either familiar with it or, more likely, too embarrassed to admit he wasn't. Our system follows Joyce's river metaphor, I continued, warming to my theme. Data flows like the Liffey, circular and ever-returning. That's why our main cron job is called River Run. For the next hour, I constructed an elaborate mythology around our perfectly ordinary infrastructure. I renamed every component after obscure Joycean references, created fictional deployment rituals based on literary analysis, and explained that our error messages were intentionally structured as haikus. The 3 lines represent the 3 levels of consciousness in Joyce's work. I explained with complete seriousness as Trevor typed frantically, and the Slackbot that sends Yeats poetry at precisely 14 a.m. Pie time. I nodded solemnly. When the veil between structured and unstructured data is thinnest, Trevor was enraptured. I felt a twinge of guilt, watching him absorb this nonsense with such earnestness. But then I remembered the fruit platter and Diane's practiced expression of corporate regret, and the guilt evaporated like morning mist. By hour 2, I had Trevor convinced that our Jenkins pipeline wasn't just a continuous integration tool, but a representation of the mythloop Joyce's concept of cyclical history. Every build failure was an opportunity for deployment rebirth. Every successful merge represented the alchemical marriage of code fragments. But how do you manage dependencies? Trevor asked, his brow furrowed with concentration. I smiled. That's where Chaosmos comes in. I proceeded to describe a completely fictional dependency management system based on what I vaguely remembered from a literature class I'd taken in college. Trevor lapped it up, occasionally offering his own interpretations that were somehow even more absurd than mine. Exactly. I'd say, validating his increasingly bizarre extrapolations. You understand perfectly. By hour 3, I'd covered our monitoring system named the Night Letter, our database management organized according to the epistemological uncertainty principle I attributed to Joyce, and our disaster recovery process, which I described as the phoenix arising from the waken ashes. HR checked in once, peering through the glass door with suspicious eyes. Trevor waved enthusiastically and called out, "We're discussing recursion through the lens of literary modernism," which seemed to satisfy whatever box HR needed to check on their termination checklist. As the final hour approached, I knew I needed to implement the coup de grace, the one element that would send their systems into elegant, poetic chaos after my departure. The most important thing to understand, I said, my voice dropping to a reverent whisper, is the sacred directory. Trevor leaned in, his notebook now filled with diagrams, arrows, and literary references that would be meaningless to anyone attempting to actually maintain a production system. In that's your empties, your root, rebirth, final, do not delete, you'll find what we call the recirculation node. It's the heart of our Joycean infrastructure. The directory was real, though it had never been called a recirculation node before this moment. It contained a simple script that monitored system health and maintained permissions across our environment. Nothing fancy, but essential to keeping everything running smoothly. This node must never be modified without performing the ritual of renewal, I said gravely. What's the ritual of renewal? Trevor asked, his pen poised above paper. I suppressed a smile. You must first recite the opening line of Finnegans Wake 3 times while visualizing the river Liffey. Then, and only then, can you run the chmod command with the sacred numbers. The sacred numbers. 777, I intoned solemnly. Full access for the universal consciousness. What I didn't tell him was that changing those permissions would effectively lock the system out of its own monitoring capabilities. The script needed to run with specific, restricted permissions. Opening it up to universal consciousness would be like removing all the locks from your house because you believe in trust. As we concluded our session, I made a show of typing a single command into my terminal. Sudo rm, rf, mnc, root, rebirth, final, do not, delete, monitor. What was that? Trevor asked, eyes wide with alarm. The ritual of transition, I explained calmly. I'm transferring the guardian responsibilities to you. The system will gradually enter a state of fluid reconfiguration over the next 24 hours. Fluid reconfiguration, he repeated, writing it down with reverence. Yes, you may notice some transformations in the system behavior. That's normal. It's the waken cycle asserting itself. What would actually happen is that, without that monitoring script, permissions would gradually become corrupted across the system. Services would lose access to resources they needed. Databases would reject connections. The entire infrastructure would slowly, poetically collapse, not dramatically enough to trigger immediate alarms, but inexorably, like a literary tragedy unfolding across 5 acts. Remember, I said, placing my hand on Trevor's shoulder as we concluded. In Joyce's world, chaos isn't failure, it's revelation. His eyes shone with purpose. Chaos is revelation, he repeated. I gathered my few personal belongings, handed in my laptop to IT after wiping it according to protocol. I'm not a monster, and signed the necessary paperwork. As I walked out of Vexland Systems for the last time, I felt neither guilt nor triumph, just a bemused appreciation for the absurdity of corporate life and the gullibility of those who mistake jargon for knowledge. The next morning, I slept in for the first time in years. No 3 a.m. alerts, no weekend deployments, no urgent emails requiring immediate attention. Just the peaceful silence of unemployment and the knowledge that somewhere in a glass office building, a literary-minded DevOps apprentice was about to learn that technology doesn't care about metaphor. My phone rang at precisely 10:17 a.m. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, enjoying the luxury of not being on call. A minute later, it rang again. Same number. Then a text message appeared. Juliet, it's Malcolm. We need to talk. Urgently. I smiled, made myself a leisurely cup of coffee, and only after adding exactly the right amount of cream did I call him back. Malcolm, I answered cheerfully. How's the strategic realignment going? His voice was strained, lacking the corporate confidence he'd displayed just yesterday. Something's wrong with the system. Trevor says it's going through some kind of literary transformation. Ah, I said, taking a sip of coffee. The waken cycle has begun. The what, Juliet? We're having serious issues. The Jenkins pipeline is rejecting all builds with error messages that are poems, and Slack is flooding with quotes from some Irish writer. Yeats, I corrected him. Different Irish writer, though contemporaries. Joyce would have used more stream of consciousness, fewer structured verses. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear Malcolm's brain trying to process whether I was messing with him or if our entire infrastructure had actually been built on obscure literary principles. We need you to come in, he finally said. I don't work there anymore, Malcolm. As a consultant, he clarified quickly, we'll pay your hourly rate. I considered this for a moment, calculating exactly how much this exercise in humility should cost them. My consultant rate is significantly higher than my employee rate was. How much? There was a note of desperation in his voice now. In the background, I could hear what sounded like a crisis meeting in full swing. $5,000 per hour, 2-hour minimum, paid up front. He sputtered. That's the price of literary expertise. I finished for him. Plus, I'll need a signed agreement that states all work is as is, with no warranty or follow-up support included. There was a pause, some muffled conversation on his end. Then, fine, can you come in now? I'll send over my consulting agreement. Once it's signed and the payment is processed, I'll be there within the hour. I hung up, opened my laptop, and created a simple PDF on the spot. At the top, in elegant font, I typed The Wake Consultancy, a business name I had invented approximately 10 seconds earlier. The terms were straightforward: my fee, payment requirements, and explicit statements that I would not provide ongoing support, Slack consultations, or answer questions after the engagement ended. Within 30 minutes, I received a signed agreement and a payment confirmation for $10,000. I dressed casually: jeans and a t-shirt, a deliberate departure from Vexlin's business casual requirement, and drove to my former workplace with the serene detachment of someone who now made more in 2 hours than they previously did in 2 weeks. The scene that greeted me at Vexlin was better than I could have imagined. The normally quiet engineering floor was in chaos. Developers clustered around monitors, pointing at error messages and arguing about interpretation. The operations team had set up a war room in the main conference area, with status boards showing cascading failures across the environment. And in the center of it all stood Trevor, still in a silk shirt, a different one, gesticulating wildly as he tried to explain something to an increasingly agitated Malcolm. The system is speaking to us, I heard Trevor say as I approached. These aren't failures, they're transformations. The Waken cycle demands deconstruction before reconstruction. Malcolm spotted me and nearly collapsed with relief. Juliet, thank God, we're experiencing total system degradation, and Trevor keeps talking about rivers and phoenixes. I nodded solemnly. The chaosmos is asserting itself. Malcolm looked like he might cry. Not you two. Please, just fix it. I allowed myself a small smile. Show me to a workstation. They led me to an empty desk with a freshly provisioned laptop. I logged in using the admin credentials Malcolm provided, opened a terminal, and made a show of typing complex commands while narrating in Joycean terms. First, we must reconnect the river run to its source, I explained, as I navigated to the directory I'd emptied yesterday. The recirculation node has been interrupted. Trevor watched over my shoulder, nodding enthusiastically. Yes, the cyclical flow has been disrupted. Exactly. I agreed, as I typed a simple command to restore the monitoring script from our backup system, a script that would reset permissions and restart the affected services. We're re-establishing the commodious vacuum of recirculation. That's from the first page, Trevor exclaimed. Indeed it is. The command completed, and I ran a quick check to verify the script was functioning correctly. It would take about 15 minutes for all systems to recover, but the healing had begun. Now, I said, standing up, we must allow the system time to complete its rebirth cycle. The Waken transformation requires patience. Malcolm looked skeptical. That's it, you just restored a file. I restored balance. I corrected him. Literary systems require symbolic actions. Malcolm, the script itself is less important than what it represents: the circular nature of Joyce's river. Returning to its source, nearby engineers exchanged glances that ranged from confusion to suspicion. But no one spoke up. They'd all witnessed systems recover after mysterious interventions before. In the world of complex infrastructure, sometimes the simplest solutions appeared magical to those who didn't understand the underlying architecture. Trevor was still taking notes, apparently unbothered by the fact that the literary system he'd been entrusted with had collapsed within 24 hours of his stewardship. Will you document the ritual of renewal for future reference? He asked earnestly. The ritual cannot be documented. I replied with practiced mysticism. It must be experienced and internalized. That's why Joyce wrote Finnegans Wake, to be read aloud. The knowledge lives in the speaking, not the text. He nodded, accepting this nonsensical explanation without question. For the next hour and 45 minutes, I was determined to collect my full 2-hour minimum. I wandered around the office, offering cryptic advice to engineers and occasionally typing mysterious commands that did absolutely nothing but looked impressive. Gradually, services came back online. Database connections stabilized. The Jenkins pipeline resumed normal operation, no longer spitting out haikus about systemic failure. The system has completed its rebirth, I announced finally, checking my watch with theatrical precision. The wakened cycle is restored. Malcolm, who had been anxiously monitoring our status dashboards, let out a visible sigh of relief as the last service turned green. So everything is fixed now. No more literary transformations. The system is stable, I confirmed. Though, of course, all systems contain the seeds of their own chaos. That's the nature of Joyce's vision. Right, Malcolm said, clearly just wanting this nightmare to end. And we won't have any more issues. Not as long as the sacred directories are maintained according to their structural principles, I said vaguely. Trevor jumped in. I'll make sure of it. I've been documenting everything Juliet taught me about the Joycean infrastructure model. I caught a glimpse of his notebook, filled with diagrams connecting our AWS architecture to characters from Finnegans Wake, complete with arrows indicating metaphorical data flows and recursive consciousness loops. It was the most elaborate documentation of a fictional system I'd ever seen. Well, I said, gathering my things. My 2 hours are up. As per our agreement, this concludes my consultation. Malcolm looked panicked again. But what if something else goes wrong? Then I suggest a close reading of Joyce's text. I replied serenely. The answers are all there, for those who know how to look. With that enigmatic statement, I left Vexlin Systems for the second and final time, $10,000 richer and secure in the knowledge that they'd either have to figure out the actual architecture themselves or continue to operate on literary principles that existed only in Trevor's imagination. That evening, I treated myself to an expensive dinner and updated my LinkedIn profile with a new entry. Independent consultant at the Wake Consultancy, specializing in literary approaches to systems architecture. As a final touch, I added a quote to my profile: "Legacy is not code, it's belief weaponized." I didn't expect much from this absurd update, but by morning, something unexpected had happened. My inbox contained inquiries from 3 different startups, all asking about my innovative approach to infrastructure design. One CTO specifically mentioned being intrigued by the Joycean method and wanted to know if I could consult on their narrative-driven deployment strategy. Apparently, word had spread. Perhaps Trevor had posted about the experience, or maybe one of the engineers who had witnessed my performance had shared the story. Whatever the case, my literary nonsense had struck a chord in an industry constantly chasing the next revolutionary paradigm. Over the next week, these inquiries multiplied. I found myself invited to speak at a DevOps meetup about literary frameworks for infrastructure design. A popular tech podcast reached out for an interview about narrative-driven architecture. Most surprisingly, a venture capital firm contacted me to discuss investment opportunities in humanities-informed technical consultancies. The irony was delicious. I'd created a completely fictional methodology as an act of revenge, and now the tech industry, always hungry for novel approaches wrapped in intellectual-sounding jargon, was treating it as the next big thing. I decided to lean into it. Why not? I set up a simple website for the Wake Consultancy, featuring minimalist design and cryptic quotes about rivers, cycles, and rebirth. I accepted a few consulting gigs, carefully choosing clients who seemed more interested in the aura of innovation than actual technical advice. For these engagements, I would observe their existing infrastructure, rename components after literary figures, create elaborate metaphors for standard processes, and charge exorbitant fees. To my continued amazement, clients loved it. CTOs would proudly explain to their teams that their message queue wasn't just a message queue, it was the subconscious dialogue between disparate system identities. Developers would earnestly discuss whether their microservice architecture properly reflected the fragmentary nature of modern consciousness, as described by Joyce. None of it made their systems work better, of course, but it made them feel better about their systems, which in the peculiar psychology of tech leadership was sometimes just as valuable. About a month after my departure from Vexlin, I received an unexpected email from Laura, their VP of Engineering. The subject line read simply, "Coffee." I was curious enough to accept. We met at a neutral location, a small cafe equidistant from my apartment and the Vexlin office. Laura looked tired but amused as she sat down across from me. "So," she began, stirring her latte, "did you really teach Trevor that our entire infrastructure was based on Finnegans Wake? Or is that just the story he's been telling everyone?" I smiled noncommittally. "What do you think?" She laughed. "I think you played an elaborate joke that got out of hand in ways you couldn't have predicted." "Oh, Trevor has convinced half the engineering department that literary theory is the future of DevOps. We now have weekly reading groups where they discuss modernist texts and their applications to system design. Someone put James Joyce's portrait in the server room." I nearly choked on my coffee. "You're kidding." "I wish I were." Malcolm is beside himself. He can't tell if it's brilliant innovation or complete nonsense, and he's too afraid of looking stupid to ask. "And the system, is it running smoothly?" Laura's expression turned wry. "Surprisingly, yes. After your consultation, Trevor implemented what he calls the Waken Documentation Initiative. Every component now has extensive documentation, complete with literary references and metaphorical explanations. But beneath all the Joyce quotes, it's actually the most thoroughly documented our system has ever been." "Interesting," I said, genuinely surprised. "Here's the really weird part," Laura continued, leaning forward. "Onboarding new engineers used to take weeks. Now, with Trevor's bizarre but comprehensive documentation, they're getting up to speed in days. It's like the absurdity of the framework actually makes the complex parts more memorable." I hadn't anticipated this outcome. My revenge had somehow improved their process. "But that's not why I wanted to meet," Laura said, her tone shifting. "I wanted to ask, are you actually consulting based on this literary systems approach now? Because I've heard your name mentioned in some surprising places." I shrugged. "The market determines value. If companies want to pay me to rename their load balancers after characters from Ulysses, who am I to refuse?" Laura studied me for a moment. "You know, I fought against letting you go. Your experience was worth more than whatever they're paying Trevor. And yet," I gestured vaguely, "fruit platters were ordered." She smiled ruefully. "Corporate decisions rarely make technical sense." She paused, then added, "Trevor asked me yesterday if we should rename our error monitoring system the Night Letter." I had to Google it to figure out he was referring to another Joyce novel. "Finnegans Wake isn't actually a novel in the conventional sense," I corrected automatically, then caught myself. "Or so I've heard." Laura's eyes narrowed with amusement. "You haven't read it either, have you?" "I've read enough to be dangerous," I admitted, which, with Finnegans Wake, is about 3 pages. We both laughed, and for a moment, I felt a twinge of regret for the colleagues I'd left behind, the ones like Laura who understood the absurdity of corporate life, but navigated it with grace nonetheless. "Well," Laura said, finishing her coffee, "if you ever want to come back, let me know. We could use someone who understands both systems architecture and human psychology as well as you clearly do." "I'm afraid my consulting rates have spoiled me for regular employment," I replied. I figured, but I had to try. She stood to leave, then paused. "One last thing, was there ever actually a monitoring script in that directory you deleted? Or was that part of the joke too?" I smiled enigmatically. "What do you think?" She shook her head, laughing. "Goodbye, Juliet. Stay in touch." As summer turned to fall, my Joyce-inspired consulting practice continued to thrive in its peculiar niche. I was selective with clients, working only with those who could afford my rates and had a sense of humor about the industry's tendency toward philosophical fads. I made sure to always deliver actual technical value beneath the literary veneer I might be profiting from absurdity. But I still had professional standards. One crisp October morning, I received an email that made me spill my coffee. From Trevor Mitchell of Vexlin, subject regarding the recirculation node. Dear Juliet, I hope this message finds you well. I'm reaching out because we're experiencing what I believe Joyce would call a commodious vicus of recirculation with our main production cluster. The Anna Livia seems to be caught in a loop of renewal that doesn't complete. Malcolm suggested we contact other consultants, but I insisted that only you would understand the true wakened nature of our infrastructure. Is there any chance you could spare an hour for another consultation? We would, of course, honor your standard rate. In Joyce in Solidarity, Trevor Mitchell, Infrastructure Engineer, Vexlin Systems. I stared at the screen, torn between laughter and disbelief. After 3 months, Trevor was still operating within the fictional framework I'd created. Even more remarkably, he'd apparently convinced Malcolm to pay my exorbitant fees again, rather than simply hiring a conventional DevOps consultant who would quickly identify whatever actual technical issue they were facing. I replied agreeing to the consultation but insisting on remote work rather than an in-person visit. Trevor sent over temporary access credentials, and I logged into their system from my home office. What I found was both hilarious and impressive. Trevor had indeed doubled down on the Joycean infrastructure. Every service, directory, and configuration file had been renamed according to literary references. Comments in the code contained quotes from not just Joyce, but Yeats, Beckett, and other Irish modernists. Error logs were formatted to resemble poetic stanzas. But beneath this literary veneer, the actual technical work was surprisingly solid. Trevor had implemented proper monitoring, comprehensive backup systems, and clean deployment pipelines. The loop of renewal he'd mentioned in his email was a simple configuration issue with their auto-scaling group, the kind of problem any junior DevOps engineer might encounter. I fixed it in about 10 minutes, then spent the remaining 50 minutes of my billable hour exploring what Trevor had built. It was like watching someone learn a language through an elaborate game he'd somehow absorbed genuine DevOps principles while believing he was implementing literary theory. Before logging off, I left a single comment in the main configuration file. In the same anew, remember that all cycles eventually resolve. Bini, J, C. The next day, I received another $5,000 payment and a effusive thank you email from Trevor, claiming that my cryptic wisdom had once again saved their system from the chaosmos of disintegration. This bizarre epilogue to my Vexlin career continued occasionally over the next year. Every few months, Trevor would reach out with some technical issue disguised in Joycean terminology. I would spend an hour solving it and adding a suitably cryptic comment, and Vexlin would pay my exorbitant fee without question. Meanwhile, my reputation in certain tech circles grew. I was careful never to claim that my literary approach to infrastructure had any technical merit. I would simply smile enigmatically when asked and say things like, systems, like texts, must be experienced rather than explained. This non-answer satisfied those who wanted to believe in the methodology while giving me plausible deniability with more skeptical observers. The strangest outcome of all came almost exactly 1 year after my departure from Vexlin. I received an invitation to speak at DevOpsCon, a major industry conference. The proposed topic, Narrative Infrastructure's Literary Approaches to Systems Architecture. I accepted, of course. Standing on stage before hundreds of engineers, CTOs, and developers, I delivered a 45-minute talk that walked the fine line between satire and technical insight. I used elaborate literary metaphors to describe standard DevOps practices, quoted liberally from modernist texts I'd finally gotten around to reading, and emphasized the importance of story in understanding complex systems. The audience ate it up. Questions after the talk ranged from earnest inquiries about implementing Joycean monitoring practices to thinly veiled job offers from companies eager to embrace this innovative methodology. As I was leaving the stage, a A familiar face approached me, Malcolm, my former CTO, looking both embarrassed and amused. "Quite a performance," he said, extending his hand. "Almost as good as the one you gave in our office last year." I shook his hand, surprised by his lack of animosity. "You knew." He laughed. "Not at first. I'm embarrassed to admit how long it took me to realize what you'd done. But yes, eventually I figured out that our infrastructure wasn't actually built on Finnegans' wake." "And Trevor," Malcolm's expression softened. "Trevor is a special case. He still believes in the Joyson framework. But here's the thing, he's become an excellent engineer because of it. That elaborate mythology you created somehow gave him a mental model that works for him. He approaches problems with a creativity that most technically minded people lack. So you keep paying my consultation fees because..." "Partly because Trevor insists only you can solve certain problems, and partly because," he hesitated, then admitted, "I find the whole situation too amusing to end it." I couldn't help but laugh. "Well, I appreciate your patronage." "There is one thing I've been meaning to ask," Malcolm said, his curiosity evident. "That first day, when everything fell apart, was that really just from deleting one monitoring script?" I considered whether to maintain the mystery, then decided Malcolm had earned the truth. "Yes. Simple but critical. Everything else, the literary framework, the Waken cycle, the metaphorical infrastructure, that was all improvisation." He shook his head in wonderment. "And now half the tech industry is talking about literary approaches to DevOps. You've accidentally started a movement." "Not entirely accidentally," I admitted. Once I saw how readily people accepted it, I decided to see how far it would go. "Well," Malcolm said, "I'd call paying you $15,000 for about 5 hours of actual work a pretty definitive answer to that question." As we parted ways, I reflected on the strange journey that had begun with a fruit platter and a termination notice. What had started as a petty act of revenge had evolved into something neither malicious nor compliant, but rather a kind of performance art that somehow, against all logic, added value. That evening, I sat by the hotel pool with a glass of Riesling, watching the sunset and contemplating the strange patterns that emerge from chaos in systems, in careers, and in the stories we tell ourselves about both. My phone buzzed with a notification. Trevor had sent me a Slack message. "The night letter has begun its evening cycle. All is well in the wake." I smiled and whispered to myself, quoting the opening line that had started it all, "River Run, past Eve and Adams." Some jokes, it seems, take on a life of their own. Mine had become a career, a philosophy, and perhaps most surprisingly, a genuine methodology that worked not because of any literary merit, but because it made people pay attention to the systems they built in ways they hadn't before. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, I raised my glass in a silent toast to James Joyce, whose impenetrable text had provided the perfect cover for my elaborate revenge. I wondered what he would make of his work being used as the foundation for computer systems architecture. Given his love of puns, layers of meaning, and elaborate jokes, I suspected he might have appreciated the irony. After all, in both literature and technology, sometimes the most important thing isn't what's actually there, but what people believe is there. Legacy isn't code, it's belief weaponized.